All right, Hugh, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing over there in Vietnam?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you, Simon. Yes, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
No, well, thank you for being here. Very excited to have an interesting conversation today. And I think many of our listeners would love to know a little bit more about you, your experience, your background. So maybe you could give us a little bit of a rundown, a bit of an intro.
Sure. Um, there are two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, I've had about six separate careers. And on the other hand, I've basically been doing the same thing, but with a different hat on. So the first thing I did when I left university was I went into theatre. And in England, there's a tradition, if you're a young person interested in theatre, you go to the Edinburgh Festival and you lose money. So I did that. Um, I then became a therapist, kind of by accident, really. But very few people really become a therapist by accident. Really, therapists are people who need a lot of therapy, but they don't realize that. So they go and train and try and think they're going to fix other people, and gradually they fix themselves. And if they're lucky, they can then give up being a therapist, or maybe they really like being a therapist and then they carry on. So I still do a tiny little bit of therapy, to be honest, but I don't have regular clients anymore. I'll either do a little burst if somebody tracks me down and really needs some help, and I have a few people who check in with me from time to time. What happened next? I was invited by a good friend to start a qualitative market research business. I'd been helping his business a little bit, and the situation changed. So we set up a market research business. Qualitative research is essentially going in depth. It's talking to people about feelings, understandings, all the sort of complicated stuff, as opposed to quantitative, which is asking a short series of questions of a large number of people. Qualitative is asking a lot of questions of a small number of people. And the two basically complement each other. They will really help if you want to understand a market or a potential policy or a new product or whatever. While I was a therapist, I was running a small, for a time, I was running a small learned society and got in touch with a chap called Paul McKenna got in touch with me. At the time, he was a DJ and he wanted to become a stage hypnotist. So I helped him to make sure that his stage act was safe. And then he moved into helping people initially, I think we started with stress and smoking, and we ended up doing a whole load of other things. So I collaborated with him for more than 25 years, I think, helping him with a bunch of books. We wrote one together called I Can Mend Your Broken Heart, and I helped him on a bunch of other ones. So essentially, I also wrote a book about negotiation along the way, and I've done a bit of teaching, and I'm just about to do some more teaching, actually, in a university here. So my experience covers psychotherapy, performance, like storytelling and theatre, business, negotiation, and qualitative market research. And the one thing I forgot to mention is that after I'd been a therapist for a little while, I went back to university and did a PhD in philosophy. So philosophy as well.
So you
It
weren't
sounds sorry.
you weren't joking when you said many hats.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wasn't a joke.
I mean, for a while I thought one day I'm going to find out what I really am going to do, and then it occurred to me, this is it. I do the same thing, but in lots of different fields. And what am I doing? I'm helping make sense of things. I'm telling stories and I'm finding solutions.
Yeah, I think from just hearing that all those experiences, all those different avenues, it sounds like you just really love learning. You really love taking in
Absolutely.
information. Yeah.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting thing. It's not so much taking in information, because the kind of modern belief about all of this is that the more you know, the better. Let's have more knowledge, let's get more data. And I think of that as a kind of horizontal thing. Let's get some more of this, let's know some more of that, as though we're I don't know, walking around a Mac trying to find more and more stuff inside it. But you only have to think for a moment or click on something on Google and you realize that's kind of a hopeless strategy. There's way too much stuff to know. In however small the field, there's still too much stuff to know. I mean, it's completely absurd. So recently it's occurred to me that what I'm really interested in is something I would call more vertical, which is going deeper into stuff. And I would call that understanding. So actually, I'm not so interested in more knowledge. I've kind of got enough, right? But I am interested in understanding better the stuff that I know, but don't yet understand well enough.
Is that got a lot to do with, it's important to obviously know, but knowing how and to actually apply your knowledge into certain aspects of your life is a very important part. It makes that knowledge and that learning active and engaging in the kind of real world.
Absolutely. And I don't know what any skills you have, but think about them. And if you're a musician, you might say, okay, I know how to play Für Elise, right? And, pretty much every piano student pretty soon knows how to do it. But then you listen to a really great musician play it. And you go, oh, okay, I know how, but I don't know how as well as that person knows how. So knowing how is exactly, it is something, but it has a depth to it, which we can kind of pursue indefinitely, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. Absolutely. I would really love to know, in your words, what psychotherapy is. If you don't mind, because we
Sure.
hear a lot. We hear a lot of words, especially in within Truehope. We work with brain and body health. We hear these words about cognition and mental and psychology, psychotherapy. All these. There's so many words kind of intertwined into a realm, and I'd love to just get, not only for my own clarification, but I'm sure a lot of other people would probably benefit from hearing, from yourself, kind of what psychotherapy actually is.
Okay. Well, if you imagine you're a fly on the wall, there's family therapy and group therapy and all sorts of things, but let's take the basic one, which is one person, a therapist, talking to another person, a client or a patient. Okay. So if you're a fly on the wall, the therapist is sitting there, the client comes in, and for 55 minutes, usually, they talk to each other. It's a conversation. That's what psychotherapy is. Now, there's any number of labels that pertain to the theoretical training that psychotherapists have. Yeah, so you could be behavioral or psychodynamic or cognitive or gestalt or whatever. But that's a bit like, what's the simile? It's a bit like saying, the way I drive my car is the way, and then you give the name of your driving instructor. Actually, the way you drive your car is the way you drive your car, right? He or she taught you something, and then you learn to do it your way. There are all sorts of really good questions about, like, what are you trying to do in psychotherapy, and what's happening? So, are you fixing trauma, or are you bringing insight, whatever? Again, those are kind of descriptive from the outside. What I would say, and what I do say to all my clients, is that let's us agree what we're going to try and do. Yeah? People come, they're very distressed, and they often say, oh, like, I can't do such and such or whatever, I'm very depressed. And it's unusual that the presenting problem is actually the key. There's normally something else going on. Yeah. But what I say is, well, let's work, and we can chunk it up. We can say, let's try and achieve this. Let's try and achieve that. If somebody's agoraphobic, let's try and achieve, let's say something, I don't know, walk down the street or something like that. We could have a little goal, but that's an interim one. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do, and what I'm kind of negotiating with my clients, is that I want them to leave me happy to face the challenges that life offers. And kind of, if you are happy to face the challenges life offers, you're doing pretty well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, especially with someone with agoraphobia or so many other things that somebody might come in
Absolutely.
with. But as you say, you're sitting across from somebody and they are coming in for the reason that they think that they need to come and see you for. But I'm sure as you kind of you both get into it, you're kind of digging and kind of getting into the root of what's leading to somebody to kind of that perspective. And would you say that a lot of the times when you're having these conversations, these therapeutic sessions with people, that primary reason that they initially came in for is never really that key aspect that you're talking about. It's usually something else.
Well, it's certainly often something else. I mean, maybe people are completely right about it. We just don't know. Typically, I would say that, psychotherapy in the modern sense started with the psychodynamic people, with Freud, essentially, who talked to people. And Freud had a theory that basically everything came down to sexual energy being expressed in different ways and getting stuck at various levels. And I think he was reductionist. I think clearly sexual energy is important, we all have to deal with it. But it's not the only driver for development, for growth, or indeed for difficulties. But that whole psychoanalytic approach was predicated on the fact that if you really understood what's going on, then you're better, right? That insight is curative. Well, I used to find a lot of people who had a lot of insight into their problems, but didn't actually manage to change their behavior. And I found it was kind of the other way around. I found that if people changed their behavior, then a little while later, they'd say, you know what, something? I've just realized something, da, 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 da. And then they would maybe tell me something about their upbringing or where they think something had come from or whatever. But I'm very interested, as a psychotherapist, I'm very interested in helping people change their behavior. After all, that's what they want. Nobody goes and wastes $100 an hour just to have a conversation, right? If I can fix it myself, I'm not going to bother going to see a therapist, am I? I'm going into psychotherapy because I can't work out. Some weird stuff is happening, either in my behavior or in my mind, that is distressing. Again, otherwise I wouldn't be coming. It's distressing and I can't really get a handle of it on it. So I go and see somebody else. And if I do that, that's a very brave thing. I've already made a strong commitment towards my own health. And I would like to congratulate everyone who's had the courage to do that, especially because sooner or later, something's going to be embarrassing. That's kind of the deal, if it's not embarrassing, we can just talk to our friends and sort it all out. But when we are willing to go and talk to a stranger and admit, I don't know, something that we're afraid of that seems weird, or some inhibition that we can't come over, then that's a very brave thing. And it's one of the good things about it is that's the beginning of the energy you can use to continue that change and positive progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Like so brave and courageous for somebody to first of all even make a phone call to make an appointment, and then to go there and keep themselves accountable to, they're taking very strong actions towards wanting to make a change. And I love what you're saying there about how you often see significant progression when you help people change their behaviors, because those individuals most likely have a lot of insight and experience to what's going on for them, and they just maybe need some practical application of how they can kind of get towards their goal, whether that's large, medium, or small.
Yeah, I have a friend who's one of his sons was very, very depressed, and my friend said to me, "Hugh, I just don't understand it. Why can't he just pull his socks up and get on with it?" And I said, "Well, so the thing is, that's what depression is. It's the lack of motivation is an integral part of depression. That's why they can't do it. I mean, it's clinically proven that the single most powerful intervention, bar none, in depression is physical exercise. Much more powerful than any other single intervention, okay? But depressed people really, really don't feel like taking physical exercise. They really don't. It's very challenging indeed, okay? So one of the things that you can do if you are depressed is start with something super small. Wherever you are, wherever you're sitting or standing, if you're depressed and you're listening to this now, maybe you're walking along with on an iPod or headphones, maybe you're sitting at home. Ask yourself, if I could just go for a walk somewhere from where I am now. Which direction is the best direction? You know, do I want to walk to the park? Do I want to go and walk down to the river? Do I want to walk towards somewhere where I can see my friends? And, you know, it's a good question. And, you know, what's the best bit of exercise I can do now? I mean, if you want to run, great, go for it. But you can start even smaller than that. You can start, okay, where do I want to go?
I think that's wonderful. And I think it's a really great segue, because you and I were chatting a couple of weeks ago on kind of how this conversation could go. And we both decided that we wanted it to be, you know, a solutions-based discussion, because ultimately a lot of people right now have only themselves to keep themselves motivated and positive and accountable during this kind of wild and stressed time. So how do you feel people can actively begin to help themselves during what seems to be, you know, like a kind of never-ending world of COVID?
Well, first of all, I would say do what works, right? I'm not the expert on your life, or anybody's life for that matter, not even my own, I have to say. I'm still finding things out. So, you know, if you're not sure, you could say to yourself, okay, well, I felt pretty terrible all this week. I was okay a little bit on Monday afternoon, but the rest of the time was terrible. So, okay, so what was it about Monday afternoon that was good? When you last felt good, what was the good thing that happened? Did you have a cup of herbal tea? Did you, I don't know, take a supplement? Did you go for a run? Did you do some yoga? Did you watch some crazy stuff on TV? I don't really care, but there's some things that make you feel a little bit better than other things. So pay attention to those things and do more of them. Now that sounds like a really almost too simple to be true suggestion, but it's actually one of the primary suggestions of the Brief Therapy Center from in Milwaukee, and it turns out to be incredibly effective. Do more of what works. So second, I don't want to diminish that. Do more of what works. The second thing I would say is do something really small. Ask yourself, not what, like you might think to yourself, what I'd really like to do is get together all my mates and go on a fabulous 2-week holiday in the Caribbean. Well, okay, maybe you would. But what's the smallest possible thing you could do that would make a noticeable difference? I mean, would it be, and for me, a really interesting one is to sit upright. Yeah, I typically tend to slouch a little bit forward, but if I sit upright, somehow I just feel a little better in myself. And that's absurdly small, but it really helps. When I'm out on my little motorbike thing, I often find myself you know, like tipping forward a little bit. I sit upright and I just feel a tiny bit better. So I'm really talking tiny bit better here. What's the tiniest thing that can help you feel a little bit better? And when you start doing that, try and find half a dozen, I don't know, sitting upright, having a glass of water. Let's say you think you want to meditate and you think, oh, I can't meditate. You can meditate for 5 minutes, not for 2 hours, not for 10 days without talking. You can do it for 5 minutes. Yeah? Something like that. So try all these tiny little things. And as you do them, pay attention to the process of change. Very many people during this time have, you know, typically people are eating too much, they're drinking too much, they're not getting enough exercise, and they're feeling depressed, and they're not seeing their friends. Okay, so somebody who will remain nameless told me the other day, she said she'd arranged to meet a friend for a socially distanced walk, you know, keeping 2 meters apart. She hadn't seen this woman for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and she didn't actually know her that well, but she was a colleague from work. And as she got there, she said, oh, I wish I could give you a hug. And her friend said, be my guest. And so they had a hug, and they had a great old time talking and walking for 2.5 hours, and they did each other a power of good. So what can we do? We need to pay attention to the small things, pay attention to the most immediate things in our own worlds. The never-ending world of COVID is actually a little bit of a a mystery, because it's out there in the media. It's out there on the screens, in the, the threads of social media and posts, and everybody being scared and frightened and so forth. But if you pay attention to where you actually live and the people you're seeing, okay, some of them are very frightened, but some of them aren't. And there are things you can do, little things for yourself, with your family. And the more you pay attention to where you really live, the less scary all the weird and terrible things are that are happening in the rest of the world. And you can become one of those little places that's creating a little bit more joy and happiness. Kill people, sadly. Those people are overwhelmingly people who are already sick, who are very old and overweight. And that is a problem, right? Dying's a problem. But it's a problem all of us have to face. We're all going to die, okay? And we don't know when we're going to die. Last year, a friend of mine drowned. He was a very wonderful man. He didn't drown of COVID. He drowned because, although he could swim, the two people who clung to him couldn't. That's tragic. He's left a family, and it's, death is not a light experience, but at the same time, it's one that's coming for all of us. Every single one of us.
Yeah, there's a lot of power and responsibility in just that statement. That can be a really, really, self-proclaimed powerful statement that you can project you to do some really wonderful things. And I love what you're talking about when it comes to trying to become aware and a bit conscious of like what does work, what is simple, what can you apply kind of immediately and now. I've got a question in regards to, do you think we pay more attention do we put more attention on the things that don't work? Do we put more attention on are we more attracted to the things in our life that maybe make us feel anxious or depressed? It's interesting because those small things you are talking about can make profound changes, and it's weird that we don't try and do them all of the time, whether that's to take 10 minutes to have a nice cup of tea, go for a walk around the block, meditate for 5 minutes, do a 10-minute yoga video. Like, all these things are accessible to everybody all the time, but for some reason we are more, I think a lot of people are a lot more attracted to the things that actually might cause us a little bit more harm, whether that's psychological or physical. And I think that's interesting. What's your take on that?
I think few people are actually attracted to harm, but we're very easily overcome by drama. And what happens on the internet and all the news media is that the internet and it started with television, really, and goes back a bit, but all of these media are attracted to conflict. And conflict is a much more interesting story than, a few people in British Columbia had a really nice day yesterday. It's just like not a story, No. Whereas some people had a huge argument about going into a supermarket without masks. That's a story, and we can take sides and shout at each other and all that kind of stuff. So drama and conflict and simplicity, oversimplified conflict is compellingly interesting. We all run on habits. So if I have a habit of paying attention to the bad stuff, I'm going to do more of it. It's just a habit, right? So I, for example, noticed that during all of this, even though I'm relatively skeptical about, I think, generally speaking, lockdowns cause more damage than the COVID. But, I'm not, the point I want to make is that I was reading about that stuff and I just got more and more upset, even when I was reading stuff I did agree with. Right. So I decided two things. One is I got to limit the amount of time I spend reading news articles about things that I find offensive. But simultaneously, it's also useful to read one or two articles from the other perspective. So rather than thinking, oh my goodness, I can't believe how many people believe such and such, how dangerous, la, 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 la. I read another article saying it's so wonderful that la 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 la. Yeah. So that I don't get stuck in a little self-righteous bubble, which is a very easy thing to do. So what can we do about all of this? We can notice our habits and then say, well, is that a habit I want? Most of the time we pick them up accidentally. Very few people say, oh, I'm going to be plenty negative today. Let me get on with it. They just don't. It just happens, right? So I have to notice it happening and think, oh, now maybe I can put a different ending, catch the same beginning. Oh, maybe the world's going terribly mad, but maybe it's time for me to have a nice cup of tea and have a call with my friend.
Absolutely, yeah. I just as you're talking about that word drama is sticking out for me, because you can't see, there's no show or movie available on Netflix that is just joy and happiness for an hour. There's significant drama, there's spikes in emotion. It's very interesting. My parents have watched EastEnders for, I want to say, 25 years. It's incredible. Like, some 5 days a week, it's the same pub, it's the same street, it's the same people. It's remarkable. But it's pure drama constantly, and it's wild and it's addicting. It's very, very, it's wildly attractive and addicting, and I suppose it's very, very difficult to get out of that habit of watching something like that and being connected with these individuals that go through all these dramas that we can associate, because we're human beings with emotions as well. And it's a really tough thing to break, like to have like a social media purge, or to stop watching the news, or to look at alternative news sources that might be, right wing if you're left, and the other way around. Like, it's a very, you have to be really, I feel like you have to be really conscious and aware of where your mind's at and what you're looking to achieve with, changing your sources of information and stimuli, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's also quite hard if you say, I've got to stop doing this, that, and the other. That kind of doesn't work. Please stop thinking of elephants. Right? It just doesn't work. Much better is to say, have you thought about giraffes? In other words, you start doing something better, and gradually the stuff you don't want kind of gets pushed out a little bit. Just a top tip there, really.
Yeah, so starting simple, recognizing kind of like what works, what is good, and kind of bringing a little bit more awareness to that. And as you pointed out, some really simple, easy examples that a lot of people can do, even if they're locked down at home, like right now. It's I think that they're the kind of like little tools that I think people know, but maybe have forgotten about, that they've got these at their disposal to, again, like, help change their environment and help change their mood a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is important to recognize some people are very, very frightened. There's been a lot of very frightening messaging going out there. Now, there are typically, people talk about the fight or flight response, when there's a threat coming, I'm going to fight it or I'm going to run away. But, and that, that's well documented, but there is a third response, which is also common and less well documented, which is freezing. Absolutely, just freezing. And a lot of people are effectively frozen emotionally. They've been so frightened by all these messages that they've lost a sense of proportion and perspective. Everything is terrifying. And that's debilitating. That's it's like having all your own energy taken away. So if you are really, really scared, you need, again, to find the smallest possible thing that you can do that will help you have a bit more of your own power back. And what is it that will make you feel a little bit more safe? Now, probably talking to someone like me isn't necessarily a good thing, because I'm relatively good at feeling safe. You need to talk to other people who are kind of scared, but maybe someone who's a tiny bit less scared, and see what they're doing and see if you can play with them for a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. That's a very good recommendation. Yeah, a lot of people, as you say, frozen at the moment for the last year or so, and if they can find something to help kind of start to think of some of other things, it's literally going to change your biochemistry and kind of get you out of that constant stress response that we know is like, the leading cause of chronic disease. And that's kind of like
Sure.
where we want to be like talking to, because this has been going on for a long period of time now. And without COVID, before that, people were quite fearful and scared anyway. And you
Mhm.
chuck something like this into it, and a lot of people like just go into this different level. And the body can only do so much when it comes to spurting out stress hormones. There's a point where it will kind of manifest into something a little bit more serious. So I think these tools and these tips are super important for your psychological and physical health. And without question, like you mentioned before, like changing your environment and exercising, whether that's like going for a walk or doing something else, like that can really, really change your um, physical body very, very quickly.
Yeah, there's a guy called Ernie Rossi back in I think the 80s. He did a lot of work with Milton Erickson, who was a psychiatrist very interested in hypnosis. And Rossi wrote a book called State Dependent Memory Learning and Behavior. What he's saying is that essentially there's a kind of circle, if you can imagine it, of there's your behavior, there's your cognition, there's your hormonal state, and then there's your emotional state. And we're not one of those things. We are a process that manifests all the way around that circle. So you can intervene at the hormonal state, you can intervene at the behavioral state, you can intervene cognitively and emotionally. And you are that process. It's not as if one drives the other. It's not that the hormones drive your brain. They're the same thing. Your thinking and the hormones, they're different aspects of the same thing. Yeah. So the neuropeptides and the electronic signaling and your cognition, we don't know actually that much about it. But the simplest description is to say that's the process that a human being is. It manifests physiologically, it manifests behaviorally, and it manifests cognitively. That's who we are. And you can intervene at any one of those levels.
Interesting. I love that. A lot of people around the world are really split right now and have been for some time. Basically, we've got a lot of people who think the reaction to COVID worldwide has been appropriate, and they're happy to kind of like go along with government regulations. And then you've got other people who are not so happy with lockdowns, mask mandates, social distancing, the prospect of vaccine passports, etc. And this is split a lot of people up, friends, families, colleagues. I've experienced this. So I wondered, I wanted to ask you, how can we start to create maybe a healthier dialogue with each other? Because at the start of 2020, we were all friends, but now things are wildly different, even between family members and people who are relatively or really close before. Things have changed, and I think everybody has got one of those people in their life.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, Simon, I don't think we were all friends at the beginning of 2020.
Okay.
COVID has been a big kind of topic and a big issue, but it's not the only one. So we have to remember that actually it's fairly normal to disagree with people. It's really okay to disagree with people. Let's say, I mean, I certainly have the experience for many years. I've had friends who say politically are to the right of me or to the left of me, but they are friends of mine. And we enjoy a dinner together, we enjoy traveling or whatever it is that we're doing. And it's okay to disagree. And one of the things that makes me know it's okay to disagree is that I know that I am not guaranteed to be right. If I know that I personally might be wrong right now, then it's easier to hang out with people I disagree with. So I might think, well, I know a certain amount, this is the way it looks to me, but I don't know 100% that I am absolutely right. And if I do know that, for example, it's a good idea for that person over there to keep themselves well away from all these people over here and protect themselves from the virus, it doesn't mean that an entire class of people should definitely do that at all times indefinitely. So the two things that help are, one is knowing that I'm definitely possibly wrong. And secondly, be very careful about generalizations. Never generalize. That's what I say. I mean, there's a deeper root for this, actually, Simon. We can't really go into it in less than about 6 hours. But there's a way of thinking that is dominant in modernity, which prioritizes abstraction, it prioritizes fixity, and it underrepresents emotional significance. So if you like, the scientific model, the academic model, where we get to describe things a lot, and what we're looking for is the kind of essence, we abstract that, yeah? And so pretty much every political ideology works like that. And it's why pretty much every political ideology fails, because we don't live in an abstract world. We live in a concrete world. We live in an emotionally inflected world. And an abstraction is not the deep essence of something. It's a tiny one-dimensional abstraction taken out that we throw back at reality and imagine we've understood it. But no, we've understood one tiny glimpse. Imagine reality is a hologram, right? It's a big glass sheet and you can see 360 degrees around it. Then you drop it. And in one tiny sliver, you can see the whole of that hologram, but in just one tiny sliver. And the delusion is that that sliver tells you the truth. It doesn't. It's part of the truth, absolutely, but it's not the whole truth. And we typically in modernity, particularly, all these kind of overarching rules, regulations, protocols, and policies focus to our detriment on a single element. I mean, actually, COVID's a really good example, because COVID is indeed a dangerous virus, particularly for old, sick, obese people. But we've abstracted that from healthcare. Like, what do most people die of? Cancer, heart disease, and COPD, and diabetes coming up behind that. Those remain the most dangerous things in the most common causes of death, even throughout all of this COVID problem. But we've, as it were, pulled out COVID and said, that's the one that matters. And most of the other health services have been downgraded. That's probably going to cause us some problems. So we should really be very, very wary of confusing an abstraction, which is some part of the truth, with the whole of reality.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. I think being open to being wrong is very important, and it should always be on the edge of your mind. Would you say that that's something like? Would that be like a tip you might have for people who are having conversations or looking to actually start to reconnect with people who they may have disagreed with? Because I totally agree with you that people have disagreed with each other on many different topics all of the time, and
Yes.
we weren't in this happy la la rainbow land pre-COVID. Yeah. But like I would say, like in my group of 100 friends pre-COVID, I was very close and connected with a lot of them. But you throw COVID into it and different opinions and different information. At the beginning of all of this, I was very strong-willed, and I was kind of like, this is my thoughts, this is it, this is my belief, this is my perception, this is it, this is that. And it took my emotional state to come down before I could start intellectually understanding that, maybe I don't know everything. There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of other people who quite rightly are open to their own opinions and beliefs. And it certainly took a bit of understanding and self-reflection on my part to start changing how I was having conversations with people. But I'm hearing from so many other people that they have lost friends, that they can't communicate with their family members anymore because I don't think they know how to do it. I think we have a very big problem in our society anyway, that we don't really communicate brilliantly with each other. We don't really learn it at school very well, like how we can create relationships, how we can repair them. It's not something. It's not really. It's kind of something you have to just figure out, or you don't. We have a lot of people walking around the world who have very poor communication skills, and it's a huge problem. And when you can have your political belief and your religious belief and all these other kind of dinner table conversations, and you can obviously have mutual respect and have kind of like a civil discourse with people, but there's something different about COVID, I think, in regards to bringing it up as a conversation piece. And I go to certain people's houses, and I just do my best to not bring it up, because I know it's just going to cause problems.
Yeah, I understand that. I do understand that. I mean, I think focusing back on the solution things, first of all,
Yeah.
If we just step back a bit, there's a tendency now, particularly because we have so much information, is basically any opinion you have, go onto the internet and you can find a bunch of people to support you, right? Anything. Flat Earth, definitely. Hundreds of people up for that. And on from there, right? So conspiracy theory, no, absolutely down the line, whatever, right? So that's the deficit, that's the problem with the internet. It's incredibly flat, but it's incredibly wide, and it's incredibly narrow. Setting that aside, one of the things that has predated the internet, but goes along with our modern version of education, is that we pay a lot of attention to theory and facts, and we don't tell enough stories. Now, you want to go and hang out with your mates, and you don't want to talk about COVID, just tell them a story. And I'm serious about this. Tell them a story. Let me tell you one of my favorite stories. I worked as a storyteller for a while, and this one actually comes from Canada. The Inuit people, my understanding, it's an Inuit story. Again, I'm not Inuit, so hey, but it's a great story, so I'm going to share it. These people believed that before everything else, there was Raven, Great Raven. And he had a nephew who was known as Little Raven. And one day, Little Raven stole his uncle's box of light. He picked it up in his beak and he flew away. And he flew and flew and flew. He flew as far as he could. He flew until he was so exhausted that he couldn't fly anymore, and he just landed. And he found himself surrounded by strangers. And he was really tired, and he was really thirsty, and he was really hungry. And he said, please, please, could you give me something to drink? Could you give me something to eat? And that's what happened. They said nothing. He said, please, I'm really hungry. I'm really thirsty. Please, can I have something to drink, something to eat? After a little while, a few of them just laughed. He said, please give me something to eat. Please give me something to drink. If you don't, I'm going to open my uncle's box of light. They carried on laughing. And he did it. He opened his uncle's box of light, and out of that box came out all the stars in the sky, and they flew up and took their place high up there. And then out came the moon, the beautiful shiny moon, and it flew up into the sky. And then out came the sun, and the sun was so bright, the strangers were so terrified that they jumped, and some of them dived down into the sea, and they became the fish. And another group jumped up into the sky, and they became the birds. And the third group was so terrified that they stuck absolutely still where they were, and they became humans.
I like it. Round of applause. That was beautiful. I was enthralled with that. That was great.
Thank you.
You're totally right. Telling stories is as ancient as it comes, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to do with people.
Yeah, I think we easily talk about stuff. So, for example, we talk about community. I mean, nowadays, like 20, 30 years ago, hardly anybody talked about it. But we talk about community. The more we talk about it, the less it actually exists. The same could be said of leadership. God knows how many leadership courses there are now. When do we need leaders? Right now. How much leadership do we have? Almost none, right? We can either do something or we can talk about it. Now, when I tell a story, community happens. we meet. I can tell that you were watching. I could tell what you were feeling a little bit, even though we're separated by Zoom. There was a certain energy that happened there. You were joining me in that story. That's what stories can do for us. There's a shed load of philosophy behind that if you want. But the important thing is pay attention. Notice what can happen. Notice that you can feel different. You can really be with somebody when you tell a story. And you don't have to be brilliant at it. You just have to do it from your heart. That'll make a big difference.
Absolutely. Just listening to something like that. I mean, I've got a 1.5-year-old son, so I read stories all day long. But using a completely different part of your brain, that creative imagination, is such a wonderful place to be. And it's a warm, tingly feeling sensation place. And it's a good place to be. It's a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Here's another top tip. Simon, tell him stories. Reading stories is good, but telling is super special. It's again, it's complicated. We'll have to talk about that another time. I have a little boy who's only 3 months old. When I tell him a story, he can't even speak yet. He looks at me. He's so enthralled, you know. Many years ago, a friend of mine brought her children to see me. They were 6, 8, and 10, right? And I told them a story. I saw them all 8 years later, right? So that makes them 14, 16, and 18. As I walked into the house, they said, "Tell us the story of the monkey and the crocodile."
Love it. That's great. Yeah, stories are huge, and they certainly take us back, and they use wonderful pathways in our brain that can, you know, really change the way that we're thinking, feeling, and behaving. So, yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, actually, is telling stories, and whether that's about yourselves or something fictional or something like that. That's wonderful. I might steal that one. I might have to find it and read it a few more times. But I like it. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Please steal it. All stories are stolen, you know.
Of course,
they've all been handed down, and we hand them on.
Recycled fiction. I love it.
Yeah.
Just before we kind of like wrap this up, I'd love to get your. We're going to talk about your most recent blog, because I really enjoyed that. But before I ask you about that, how big a part does our choice of information play into our perceptions of kind of like what's going on in the world?
Obviously, kind of big. Yeah. I mean, do you know what the German word is for a television?
Program something.
No, it's called Fernseher.
Okay.
Fernseher. It means far away seer, looking far away. Okay. And basically, nowadays, that's the normal way that we get information. Not really the TV, but the internet. But we get information from a long way away, from a very distant place. Okay. So it's slightly distorting. Like, we're all a long way away from where we actually live. It's a whole lot more helpful to pay real close attention to what is all around you right now, like really around you physically, the people you are with. Yeah. So that's one thing. It's not just that whether you pick a left-wing or a right-wing media source or whatever, but all of that media tends to be a long way away from your life. You know, Facebook is a long way away from your life because it's got people all over the blinking world, you know, popping stuff up. And it's all like confectionery, you know, one little sweet, that's nice, you know, but eat half the confectionery shop and it makes you sick. So social media is very, very like that. You just have to be careful not to take too much of it. And ideally, none at all. It rots your teeth. Or maybe that's the sugar. I can't remember.
I love that so far away idea, and you're absolutely right. Any kind of news source, whether that's TV or off the internet or if a blog or whatever, it's far away from us. And if you were to, you know, if I mean, I don't watch TV really. I watch a show or two, but I don't watch the news or anything like that. And if I didn't see people like, you know, walk in my world, in my reality, like in my day to day, that's with me right now, that's connected to me, and I walk around in my community, like if I didn't see masks, I wouldn't know that anything else was going on in the world, you know. And that's really interesting because that's a lot more real to me than watching some sort of TV news anchor telling me a bunch of stuff about what's happening like all over the world, you know. So that's a really interesting point that you bring up. Thanks for that, because that's made me think a little bit differently about all of these incredible news sources. They're just absolutely everywhere. We're kind of polluted with them, to be honest. And yeah, if you can take the time to filter that out a little bit, and you know, go out into your world and see things for kind of what they are with your own two eyes, I think that paints a much different picture that's splashed at us constantly.
Yeah. So here in Vietnam, when somebody dies, they have a wake at the house. So and always you'll find they take a little bit of the street, they put up a kind of, not really a marquee, a tiny gazebo thing, and put some tables out, and people come around to pay their respects to the family and to give their respect to the person who's died. So it's kind of ordinary to see that. That's what always happens, right? So just this morning I came back, and the little alley I normally motorbike down, it was half closed off because there was another funeral. You know, people die, and we see that. That's normal. Very few people actually have died of COVID in Vietnam, but people still die. So unfortunately, because we don't see what's happening on our own world, and we do see this kind of weirdo dramatic picture painted by the people who want eyeballs on media, we kind of forget that death is part of life. So that makes it way more scary when people start talking about it a whole lot more. But actually, death is part of life, you know. I'll tell you a little story which I rather liked. When my aunt died, who I loved greatly, there was a beautiful service in the church, and then there was a wake at her house. And then late at night, I was driving home, and this was in London. And very close to my house, somebody ran out in the middle of the road and waved at me, trying to stop the car. Now, your average response to that in London would be to swerve and drive on, right? Because everyone's nuts. Luckily, I didn't. I stopped, right? And this guy, he was from there's a place where they were putting refugees, and he could hardly speak English, but he said to me, "Help, help." And I could see there was his wife. She was pregnant. And in fact, she was about to give birth. So he needed to get to the hospital. So I said, "Get in." They both got in the car, and we drove, I don't know, half a mile down the road. I took them to the hospital. And I thought, well, there you are. One out, one in. That's life.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's some wonderful traditional cultures that have a much different relationship with death than we do kind of in the West. I think that, yeah, like death and dying is, especially here in Canada and America and in the UK, you know, we put our old people in blocks of flats with other old people, and we distance ourselves from them because we don't really want to think about death too much, and we bury people in the ground, and we do have funerals and things like that. But we have these other traditional cultures that, you know, have these kind of like much bigger events that are much, in my opinion, I want to say like a better tribute to the life of somebody rather than just like focusing on the death of somebody. And yeah, we have a very interesting relationship with life, but also like very strangely with death. Like a lot of people are super afraid of it and super scared of it. And yeah, it's definitely a part of the response to COVID. I'd love to get into, so your most recent blog was titled The Ferguson Correspondence, and specifically I really enjoyed how it concluded. I'll put a link to it in the show notes so people can get to it and read it, and I'm sure there'll be others up there by the time this goes out. But you put forward that what we kind of need now is humility by our scientists, by our politicians, and even from the skeptics. They need to be practicing empathy. And I really love that. Do you think the scientific community, our governments, and our skeptics are capable of this at this point?
Well, I think people are capable of it. I think, again, it's one of those illusory generalizations to talk about the scientific community. I could talk about the human community, but here we are, we're in the human community, but there's an awful lot of diversity and disagreement in this human community. And the same is true amongst scientists, and for that matter, governmental people or skeptics. So are people capable of humility? Well, we all are. The kind of key is to try and be humble before you're humiliated. So, because it's coming for you. Sooner or later, you are definitely going to be proved wrong. So you kind of need to be prepared for that, really, or it would be a better thing to be prepared for that. There are people who like to deny it, and they do cause a lot of trouble, it has to be said. Let me, I just was thinking about this just a moment ago, and I thought, well, hey, let's take a scientist, how about a famous Nobel Prize winning scientist like Richard Feynman? And here's a quote. He's got lots of lovely things to say. One of them was, if you thought that science was certain, well, that's just an error on your part. Now, he was a pretty good scientist. Another way he talked about the scientific method, he says, we are trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible, because only in that way can we find progress. And just one more from Feynman, I'm smart enough to know that I'm dumb. So there are some, it's a little bit unfair to talk about the scientific community and sort of lump everyone together. One of the difficulties of modernity, and it's a really tough call for scientists and academics, is that science is kind of massively misrepresented. It's understood as this wonderful search for the truth, but actually it's a career. Nowadays, by the end of the 20th century, science was primarily a career. At the beginning of the 19th century, science was a vocation. It was a weird, crazy, bizarre thing that a few really eccentric people indulged in, right? It wasn't taught in schools. It was just these people who were obsessed with understanding the world, and they were up to it, and they did wild and wonderful things, normally on their own. Now, science is industrial. It's an enormous activity. And if you're a scientist, and let's say you have a couple of kids and a mortgage, and you have an inconvenient idea, it's kind of problematic. I mean, not just COVID, take climate change. Let's say you found out something, so, oh, well, maybe, there's something else going on, not just carbon dioxide. Whoa, that's going to be a really difficult thing to pursue. It might threaten your career, your funding, right? Your funding is mostly episodic, right? You have to do something that people want to fund. So there are massive pressures on science, and there are massive pressures elsewhere. Don't get me wrong. They're not the only people suffering from this. But it's very, very hard to think deeply and clearly and understand things when you're, as it were, in the middle of a big river, which is flowing quite strongly in a certain direction. It's hard to paddle your own canoe these days.
Yeah, I like that. That's a very interesting take on it, especially within the scientific community, because quite clearly, we all have the ability to be empathetic and express humility, but sometimes our circumstances don't allow it. Simple as that, I suppose.
They make it difficult.
It's very, very difficult. There are certainly people out there who, literally put their necks out and put their lives on the line to, maybe have a different point of view. But, if you just look throughout history and throughout science, it's those individuals that, that create and make kind of the biggest splash.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to finish up there, Hugh. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. I'd love to get you back on, because I think there's a bunch of things that we could talk about, but I think we jumped to a few really interesting points. We had some solutions that people can kind of jump into now. How can people get hold of you?
Well, I have a website. If you stick it in the program notes, that'd be great. It's hughwillbourn.com, HUGHWILLBOURN.com. And you can click on the blog and find out what I'm writing. I kind of got diverted a bit by this COVID thing. I'm not that excited by it. I'm more interested in helping people become more confident of themselves, including their shadow, and find better ways to educate ourselves. I think that's, but let's do that. I'd love to come back and talk to you about that, because there's a whole world of re-understanding education, which we could really do with these days. And I think it's also really exciting and good fun.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to getting you back on to talk a little bit more into that. But thank you so much again. For more information on anything that we've spoken about in this episode, please make sure you check out the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. Thank you so much for listening. This is Truehope Cast, the official podcast of Truehope Canada. We will see you next week.